incredible university, and we're very grateful for this Center of Ethnomusicology to host us. We are Bellas Artes Projects. I'm the artistic director, and our funding director, Jana Kusar, is also here. We are a nonprofit arts organization that has many activities. One of them happens in Bataan province at the other side of Manila Bay, where there's a very active residency program where we bring not only artists but also researchers sometimes and curators to spend some time within a specific context and create their ideas or just bring ideas together. In the case of Manila, we have an exhibition space in Makati, which has an exhibition that closes this Friday, is the last day, so please visit us. Everything is on our website. And since over 9 months ago, we've been starting a program called Eskwela, and the name comes from a reflection of our own institutional name. Bellas Artes Projects references the School of Fine Arts, Bellas Artes, or Bellas Artes in Spanish, one of the first fine arts academies, who at some point in its history was housed in a building that was disassembled and reassembled now in Bataan, where our artist residency program happens. If you want to know more about our other programs, maybe in the break you can tell me. And I wanted to do some thank yous before we have just one small introduction before hearing Candice, our guest. And we wanted to thank specifically, as I've said, our incredible host, Grace in particular, for making everything happen. And this center has an incredible history that you should go into it, come back to the amazing archives that they have, audio files that were collected by its founder, Jose Maceda, an incredible artist himself. And I wanted to acknowledge and present to you Warren Mucci, if I got it right, and Kano Figueroa from the Embassy of Canada, and thank them, because without their support, we wouldn't have had the chance to have Candice here. Candice not only is giving this talk, but she's also doing a very intensive seminar program with about 16 participants, some of them who come from indigenous groups or identify with specific indigenous groups of the Philippines. And through their support and through the support of a private donor, we've also had the chance to actually fly in and give scholarship to this participant. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm the only one in a suit, so I think that's rather appropriate for a government official. Yes, it's true. I can't deny that I am from the Embassy of Canada. So thank you very much. I'm very pleased. I'm going to read some of these remarks because I have not put them to memory. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this public lecture and to welcome Candice Hopkins to present today in the discussion on the intersectionalities of art, history, and culture. Art has always been an integral part of the preservation and expression of culture in Indigenous communities. Canada's Indigenous communities, the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, are a rich source of artistic expression, shaping Canada's cultural and artistic identity. Learning and appreciating Indigenous communities' art is an opportunity to celebrate the richness of the multi-layered tapestry and diversity of their cultures. Canada has come to learn that diversity is a source of creativity, resilience, and strength. Canada's diversity makes us richer in every sense, and we embrace diversity as a characteristic of our national identity. Our past, however, is marred by examples. Sorry, I'm getting all emotional actually, because I was reading about something recently. Our past, however, is marred by examples of exclusion, most notably the intergenerational legacies of assimilationist policies such as the residential school systems. National reconciliation remains Canada's most notable inclusion challenge. But we continue to take steps to overcome this challenge. In July 2017, Canada released a set of principles respecting the Government of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. The principles will guide the review of laws, policies, and operational practices and form a foundation for transforming how the federal government partners with and supports Indigenous peoples and governments. In 2018, Prime Minister Trudeau, who you will remember came here for ASEAN in 2017, announced that the Government of Canada will develop, in full partnership with the First Nations, Inuit and Métis people, a recognition and implementation of rights framework. These are just a couple of steps being taken to advance the rights of our Indigenous peoples. Canada works at home, in the Philippines, and around the world to promote inclusion and respect for diversity as a proven path to peace, prosperity, and respect for human rights. Inclusion is the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. Exclusion diminishes us all. Only when we all choose inclusion can we fully realize the economic, social, cultural, and democratic benefits that it brings. Inclusion allows everyone to fully and meaningfully participate in the economic, social, cultural, civil, political life, and society as a whole enjoys the benefits. Engagement drives innovation, helping to build prosperous, resilient, healthy, and safe communities. Candice wrote last year that art allows us to hear in moments of silence, to open our ears rather than to close them. I hope that today's event serves as a platform to help us to hear and to further open our ears. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the lovely welcoming remarks, both on behalf of Bellas Artes and also on behalf of the Canadian Embassy. It's an honor to be here, and when Inti first invited me, it seemed like an incredible opportunity to learn from here, to learn from all the participants in the workshop. We had an amazing morning. But also to expand my understanding of how different Indigenous people from around the world are, what their questions are, what their struggles are, and what their strategies of resistance are, right? I think that sharing is incredibly important. So Inti asked me to share a couple of projects, and I'll do so. The first is I'll share a number of artworks from it just closed. It was the very first, or the inaugural, Toronto Biennial of Art. And it closed on December 2nd. It opened on September 18th in the largest city in Canada. It's part of what you could say a kind of proliferation of biennials around the world, but I think through what we were trying to do, we were trying to think about what the potential of that platform is now, and how we might invest in artists as part of that platform. And the second thing that I wanted to share with you is a project that we recently completed for the Venice Biennale with a media art collective called Isuma, and they're from the Canadian Arctic. Isuma in Inuktitut means to think for oneself. And that's what they've been doing since the late 1980s. But to begin with, I wanted to share a video, we'll see how long it will play, from a group called The New Red Order. And this video is called Never Settle. And it's something that we commissioned for the Toronto Biennial of Art. And you'll see that it has a kind of like a tongue-in-cheek or funny take on ideas of decolonization, of settlement, of the apology, and also guilt. So I'll start with a clip from that.
computers will be just as intelligent as a human. Computers will be more intelligent than all of humans combined. The human race as we know it will become obsolete.
Hello, I'm Jim Fletcher, award-winning actor.
Are you doing it on purpose, Mr. Collins? I didn't say action. I'm the one who says action.
And reformed Native American impersonator. The most Indian part of my costume was a horsetail. I did a dance, which I didn't know how to do. I'm an accomplice to Indigenous people. I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm sorry. And for the purposes of this video, you can think of me as their proxy.
The winner is Marlon Brando in The Godfather.
Accepting the award for Marlon Brando in The Godfather.
I'm representing Marlon Brando this evening. He very regretfully cannot accept this very generous award. And the reasons for this being...
But before we get into that, I'd like to let you in on something that changed my life forever.
Ever since I've been working the program, I feel so much better.
What the
The best investment I ever made in my life.
It opened up a whole new world for me.
I've learned to help without getting in the way.
And I don't have to do it alone. It is so much fun to have Indigenous friends and mentors.
There was this moment when everything kind of clicked.
It's a beautiful thing, and you should just do it. This free introductory video, the new Red Order, Never Settle, will tell you what you need to know to take control of your life today.
Well, as the program continued, I started to sleep better. I had higher levels of energy. My work improved a lot.
I don't even feel guilt at all.
And I just felt much happier in general.
It's so reassuring to wake up in the morning and know that I'm making a difference helping repatriate land for Indigenous peoples.
It's something to feel good about.
This is the first time I know I have the tools to really change my life.
I've been able to access parts of myself that I didn't even know existed.
If more of us engage in this way, it could ripple outward and change everything about how we relate to one another.
It makes you a better you. That's what it means to me.
They've given me a gift, and I can't wait to return it.
My reality's been reconfigured, and I've never been happier.
I enjoy working with the NRO. I enjoy how I feel after working with the NRO. And I look forward to repatriating all Indigenous land and life.
Nandito tayo ngayon sa may pier ng Tacloban at napakalakas ng hangin.
We are living through an unprecedented, profoundly unsettling.
I'd like to talk to you about the end of our country and the end of the world.
So maybe that's a good place to pause this. So, as you witnessed, the New Red Order is a public secret society. Anyone is welcome to join to be part of the New Red Order. So I encourage you to. They actually have a 1-800 number that I hope works in the Philippines. And when you dial the number, there are a series of prompts that you can use to also become part of the society. So this commission by New Red Order was one of the first things that you saw, actually, when you entered and witnessed the Toronto Biennial of Art. But before people came to the exhibition and saw the installation, there was a recruitment campaign that they did that took place on our website. It took place on subway ads. It took place on their platform as well to expand the order. And I think that what they were doing as well was going back to what is called, it's a still functioning society in Alaska and other parts. The artists are from Alaska and Minnesota, and it was called the Order of Red Men. And so it was a Masonic order, so part of the Freemason Society. And it was an example of a time when there was a great desire to take on Indigenous identities. And one of the artists who is a formative member of New World Order is from that community in Alaska. And so his question was, when we're thinking about decolonization, when we're thinking about questions of repatriation, of land claims, how can he create a different secret society that is much more expansive, that, as you can tell, is based on this kind of cross-cultural sharing of knowledge and abilities. But it's also, as you can see, very cathartic for some members of New Red Order of the society. This is the installation as part of the biennial. It also had a anonymous state figurehead that actually spoke. So his mouth opened and closed. It was animatronic, but no words came out, actually. So it was completely silent. And in a way, it was never meant to represent any kind of specific person, but it also looks a lot like Jim Fletcher, who was the person at the beginning that you saw, who is a member of a group called the Worcester Group. And New Red Order did a kind of intervention after he, as part of the Worcester Group, performed kind of his idea of a Plains native dance. And so they were invited in to do this intervention. And now he's really a spokesperson for the New Red Order. On this wall, they included a lot of objects that they say are part of their initiative that's called Culture Capture, which they see as a kind of reverse repatriation. So taking the things in colonial society that are valued in colonial society and actually making digital copies of them. What was already mentioned is a big conversation that's happening right now in Canada and definitely influenced our making of this exhibition, which just closed, was what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was a series of commissions that were held throughout the country, and it was really, in my knowledge, my grandmother took part in this, the first time for a lot of people that there was a kind of public declaration of what had happened within the residential schools. And since then, I think that there's been a real, you could call it a kind of historical reckoning within the country of Canada to understand not only this kind of government-formed forced cultural assimilation and how that affected different generations, but also a new set of conversations that are taking place around self-determination and sovereignty. So this was the outside of one of the main venues for the Toronto Biennial of Art. And you can see that on the banner, which was 40 feet long, it says, yours for Indigenous sovereignty. And what is becoming a kind of recurrent symbol of Indigenous sovereignty, particularly that's being worn in a lot of protests, and is the ribbon skirt. So it's worn by women. It's kind of appropriation of Plains culture that's become a kind of pan-native aesthetic. And this is by a collective of women who are all from the north in Canada, some from my region in Carcross in the Yukon, and they're called Rematriate. So something we were talking about in our conversations in the workshop this morning is how we might start changing these conversations around repatriation through thinking about what our structures of societies. For many Indigenous groups, especially along the northwest coast in Canada, we're matriarchal and matrilineal. So the idea of patriation is not something that really works within our society. So what does it mean to change that? What does it mean to think of rematriation not in terms of bringing back cultural belongings, but in terms of thinking about a kind of structure of a whole community or whole society. So I think some of these ideologies were carried through in many of the artworks. So this is a series of photographs by a Lakota artist named Dana Claxton, who's lived in Vancouver for a long time. And she had a question about self-portraiture, particularly given that a lot of the ways that images of Indigenous people have circulated in popular culture often, in some of the earliest photographs, especially in the 1800s, were taken by other people, right? And so the photographs of us became a kind of currency. And some of those photographs were heavily staged. They weren't necessarily that authentic, especially the ones of a very famous photographer named Edward Curtis. But for Dana, the reason that she started, and this is a self-portrait, started doing these photographs is so that the wearers could show their belongings. And for me, all of the belongings form a kind of web of relations, because all of these things that she's wearing have been gifted to her. Some of them are things that her family has passed down. Some of the things, I can tell what's on her shoulder is actually a moose hide bag, so it comes from the north, closer to where my area is. Some things are from the plains. Some things are clearly Lakota. Some are very contemporary, like the medallion she's wearing. And this is a portrait of Janine Freitman-Jutli, who's one of the collective members of Rematriate. And you can see that even what's on her eyes is actually beadwork that to me looks like it's clearly from South America. But then other things like the hats and things are things that are being made in her community, which is even farther up in the Yukon. They're Wichin people, so they're also Caribou people. So one of the things that we did with this exhibition is we asked every artist that participated, we asked them all a question, and they all responded in a different way. And that question was, what does it mean to be in relation? Some people took that differently. They thought about our families, they thought about kinship. Other people were thinking about these kind of disconnects, like how we're often very disconnected from our environment, right? So that was really a start for us for this exhibition. We called it the Shoreline Dilemma, in part because all of the venues were along the shoreline in Toronto. And Toronto is a city that's on the system of what are called the Great Lakes. So some of the largest freshwater system in the world. But yet, when I first started coming to Toronto to research this project, it felt like the city had its back to the water. So all the buildings actually face away from the water for the most part, except for the new ones. And then the water has been changed and shifted and rebuilt and filled in based on a desire for certain kinds of development. So the first thing that they did was they straightened the Don River. And when you straighten a river and they filled it actually, the banks with first timber and then concrete, you lose the river's ability to clean itself. So that means that every year now they have to dredge 60,000 tons of sediment out of the river to keep it flowing, because they turned it into a right angle and made it completely straight. And the reason that they did that actually in the 1800s was to speed up the flow of pollution, because at one point in time there were 37 industries that pushed their effluent into the river, including sewage. And so it became so polluted that they had to find a way to get the water into the lake faster and faster. And so a lot of conversations I was having with artists, especially Indigenous artists, were thinking about the water as an ecosystem, thinking about our disconnection from it, thinking about the question of what happens when water is turned into not only a dump, but then a commodity, when it's not valued, and how really our relationship with the water is a reflection of the health of the society. So if we can't respect the water, then it's almost as though it feels as though we can't take care of ourselves. So this question of water was something that permeated and became very important for many of the artists who came to Toronto to make work. This is a piece by Hera Boyaktashian, who's actually based in Istanbul. And one of the things that she was really inspired by was the idea that the shoreline of Toronto, which in one part actually stretches, because they kept filling it in, it stretches 1 kilometer into the lake. She was thinking about when they were stretching that, they had to build it all up on trees, on timbers. And so for her, that represented almost like what you're walking on is an underground forest. So she called this work Reveries of the Underground Forest. And then she was also thinking about, so she burned into the carpets these very specific patterns. And she took the patterns from both the immigrant neighborhoods in Toronto, particularly where people were settling from places like Turkey, but also different maps that came from her community as well. And so that's also why she decided to expose some of them. They were actually patterned the whole way through, and then keep them upright so that they looked more and more like trees. This is a new video, and it's part of a longer series by an artist named Susan Shupley, who's also Canadian but teaches in London at Goldsmiths. And she was one of the co-founders of a group, very important group called Forensic Architecture. So the forensic analysis of space. And she became very interested in an expansive view of material witnessing. So how things like what you're seeing here is a core of ice being taken out of the mountain, and how ice core archives, and there's many around the world, I knew nothing about this until I started talking to Susan, become an archive of geologic change, climate change, basically. Some of them you can study. The longest one is 5 kilometers long, and it was extracted from my community, actually, on the Logan. It's called the Logan Mountain, and that's up at Haines Junction in the Yukon. And that one cost $50 million to extract, but that one contains more than 100,000 years of climate history, right? And then the only way that they can study the ice cores is by melting them, because when you melt them, that's when the trapped air is released. So this is an example of a small sliver of an ice core that they cut, and then they melt it to get this information. So she was really interested in the fact that the only way to study them was actually to destroy them. And then that because some of them are so big, that they actually had to develop different cameras in order to document them properly. So they had to completely change photographic technology in order to really understand how these ice core archives work. So the next project that we'll do with Susan, because I'm working on the next edition of the Biennial, is an extension of this, because her question as well is, especially as it relates to the Arctic, whose testimony is taken as scientific record? Whose testimonies are understood as fact? And for the longest time, it wasn't the people living in the north who people listened to, it was the scientists, but the scientists didn't live there full time. So they didn't really understand always how the seasons affected things, how ice had changed. So people say a lot in the Arctic now, where I spend a lot of time, is they say, it's almost like the ice now is rotten. So you can't trust it all the time because it has all these little fissures and it's totally changed. And when I ask people there, what is the biggest effect of climate change? And they say, you see it in the ice. But one of the things a story that was became really famous a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, was the elders up in the Arctic in Canada were saying that they were telling everyone that the horizon line had moved. They said the horizon line has shifted. And the scientists said, no, that's impossible. There's no way that can happen. And they said, no, it's moved. It's really moved. It's moved farther out. It looks different now. And then, of course, what they learned later was because of the gases and because of the warming climate, of course, the horizon line has shifted because it's changed the way that we see it. The gases in the atmosphere have changed the way that the horizon line looks in the Arctic. So it has moved. They were right all along. So the next thing Susan will do is to do what she's calling an ice law forum in the Arctic. in collaboration with Nunavut Arctic College. So one of the things that we were really interested in this exhibition is oftentimes when you work on biennials, just means that they take place every 2 years. It's actually a very short time to work on a project. So this is a chance for her to work actually for a period of at least 5 years on one thing, and we'll show different iterations. So kind of shifting gears a little bit to talk again about truth and reconciliation. This has been a conversation that has been happening among many people in Canada, between citizens, government, different First Nations, and thinking about how do we make the recommendations in that report actionable? So how do we take action on that? How do we make it so that it's not just a question that circulates within the government, and it's not just an issue that impacts First Nations, Métis, Inuit, but how do we shift it? So this was an idea by an artist, A.A. Bronson, who formed a collective called General Idea in the 1980s in Toronto, and he is now based in Berlin. He was doing more research into his family's history. And when he did this research, he realized that he always knew this, but he didn't know all the details, but that his great-grandfather was the first minister, the first priest in Siksika Nation, and then his son, so AA's grandfather, became then the next minister in that community. But they also were the ones who built the first residential school called Old Sun. And because of that residential school, it means that many people lost their languages, their customs. They were really divorced from their culture. So he had the question of, how does he make this kind of history personally accountable? So he published this book. It's called A Public Apology to Siksika Nation. And it was a book that was available through the course of the exhibition for free. We published 14,000 copies. But before he did that, of course, he had to go back to Siksika. And he met there someone I put him in touch with, actually, an artist named Adrian Stimson, who just moved back to his community. So Adrian is also a hereditary chief, although he's never taken that role. And his great-grandfather, his name was Old Sun, and that was the name that they gave to the residential school. So Old Sun and AA's great-grandfather were sometimes colleagues, but mostly adversaries. And Old Sun actually was the one who helped initiate the Siksika resistance when they burned down the residential school because they were tired of it. And neither AA or Adrian knew that they had this family connection until they started talking to one another. And then what happened was AA was invited to go to Siksika, and Adrian held a dinner for him. He held a dinner with other residential school survivors, and Adrian's also a residential school survivor, in part to see whether this was something that they wanted to do. Would this be appropriate? Is this something that they're interested in? And then we brought out 5 members of Siksika Nation, including, of course, Adrian, who made this table setting for the exhibition. And AA apologized. And it was a kind of extraordinary moment because the residential school survivors said that, except for the government, which is a different apology, no one had ever personally apologized for what happened. So in a way, this became a narrative that started to shape the exhibition as a whole, and it's the very beginning of a much larger project, because one of the things that AA discovered in his research into his family archives, which extended to the British Museum, because there was an exhibition that his great-grandfather participated in where he lent a lot of things that had been given to him from Siksika Nation, including some ceremonial dress, a headdress as well, a lot of other items. But from the family's recollection and from his notes, they were only supposed to be temporarily loaned. But museums don't think that way often, especially not the British Museum. And so AA visited. First they didn't let him actually see them, but then he's very, very persistent. And they brought everything out. And he said, well, from our family record, these were only supposed to be here temporarily. And they said, well, we can produce a bill of sale, but they still haven't produced the bill of sale. So Siksika Nation now believes that this is a possibility for them to work on repatriation. Let's see. But at least it starts the dialogue. Because these things, they belong in their homeland. Here's a few other examples of works that we included. This is a drawing by an artist from Cape Dorset in the Arctic. His name is Kavavau Manami. And Kavavau is one of the few artists that I've seen from this small community called Cape Dorset who are doing work in response to the changing climate. One of the favorite fish from up north is called Arctic char. And then you also see eel represented. But what you see in the middle is a kind of unusual fish. And he said that he's noticing different species coming to the Arctic now because of the warming waters. And so that's why he's represented this drawing where there's this new species and they're all eating each other. Another drawing that we included of his is kelp or seaweed, and it's red. And he said that the kelp in Cape Dorset was always green, but in the last 10 years or so, it's been turning red. So it's another shift. These are made out of a technique of rammed earth, so compacting earth really, really tightly. Every single one of them is the same diameter of a borehole in the province of Ontario to explore for minerals, for mining. So this is a work that's done by two women. They're a collective. They're called New Mineral Collective. And they call themselves the largest and least productive junior mining company in the world. So one of the things that they did as part of this project was they actually incorporated as a junior mining company. Because one of the things that we learned is that 80% of mining corporations in the world have a headquarter in Toronto, which is pretty huge, right? But unlike banks, which advertise themselves, it's almost completely invisible in the cityscape unless you know where to go. But part of the reason that they also incorporated as a junior mining company was to stake claims so that those lands could be left dormant, right? And they were also thinking about how then they gained access to a lot of different mapping technology that you wouldn't have access to otherwise. Mining in particular has a lot of their information, their technologies are incredibly advanced, more advanced mapping than I've ever seen in my life. And in Toronto, they also have the biggest mining convention in the world, which they also participated in, and they made a new film in response to that. So keep an eye out for New Mineral Collective. This is an example of how we included Isuma's film within the Toronto Biennial, but I'll go deeper into that in a moment. So this question of ecosystems and relationality really extended to many of the artist's works. These are a series of new drawings made for us by Abel Rodriguez, who's an Onuya elder living now on the outskirts of Bogota and in Colombia. I really became familiar with his drawings first through a series of works that he did called Seasonal Changes in the Amazon Rainforest. So Abel, who's now he's in his early 80s, he didn't start as an artist. He actually started first, he said, his education was interrupted when he was sent to Spanish boarding school. So he was learning about the plants from his grandfather. That was his education. So he was learning to know all the properties of the medicinal plants, the healing properties, also which animals fed on them, which animals dispersed the seeds, what season you should gather them in. And then when he was displaced from his community in the 90s, he started working for a non-government organization called Troppenbos. It's actually happened to be a Dutch organization. And he was a guide, so he would bring all of these other botanists from Europe into the Amazon. And he said, you know, for the first few years, he was very quiet. He didn't interrupt anyone. He didn't tell them that, you know, some of the things they were talking about were either incorrect or had no basis in reality at all. And then Troppenbos realized that the biggest source of knowledge that they had was in Abel. So Abel started making these drawings. And the original drawings are still in the hands of the NGO, but he started documenting his knowledge. And now he's made, I would say, hundreds, if not more than 1,000 drawings. Many of them documenting different species of plants like yuccas, palms, many drawings of palms in all the seasons. And then he will often write all of their properties in his language and then include a Spanish translation. So now there are books, there are all these drawings, because for him, he really feels like an urgency, right? A lot of this knowledge is being lost, and he wants to make it as accessible as possible. So now for the second edition of the biennial, which opens in 2021, he's collaborating with his son Wilson, who's in his 50s, and they want to go back to the area where they're from and to make a film. And the film, one of their challenges is, and I think it's a beautiful challenge, how do you make a film from the perspective of the plants? So how do you make a film that would see the world or feel the world or sense the world as though, you know, you could look if you were a plant? But also thinking about what effects certain plants have on different perspectives and on your body, right? So that's part 2. Being along the shore meant that we were really looking deeply into all of the different organizations and buildings that were along the shoreline. Toronto shoreline has a lot of both active and dormant military sites. And this is one of them. This is actually the inside of the Navy, HMCS, Her Majesty's Canadian ship, York, this is called. And what it feels like when you go into this building, it actually feels like you're in the belly of a giant metal ship. It's a highly resonant space. When you enter, you actually go through all the protocols, naval protocols, as though you were entering, boarding a naval ship. And they actually call any land-based building that the Navy works on a stone ship. So this is their stone ship. And we collaborated with an artist and a composer. So Althea Thalberger, who's from Vancouver, and Suzanne Kite, who's a Lakota composer, to work in collaboration with the Navy's band. So there was one night that the Navy invited us to go and to go to their club, actually, where they play, and you know, it's just like a social thing. And so Althea and I went, and at the beginning it was more conventional. They're playing brass instruments, and then at the very end of the night, and it was getting close to midnight, they pulled out all of these shells. So to our knowledge, and to also the knowledge of the people who play in the band, this is the only conch shell sextet, at least that we know in the US or Canada. And Suzanne worked with them as a composer to make a new composition. And when they were playing the shells, so based on the size of the shell and where you put your hand in it, they of course all play different notes. They made a new composition that was also based on the formation of the shell, so they were moving in a spiral. And in that space, with the conch shells, it actually vibrated the building, so it was highly, highly resonant. And you could hear it from, I would say, maybe 4 blocks away when they were performing. So one of the things that we wanted to do as part of this biennial was to think about how we can support artists to make new work, how they might make work in response to this place, many were from Toronto, but we also included many artists who were not from Toronto. How they might respond to this question of what it means to be in relation. But we also wanted to provide a lot of support, so we created a standardized artist fee structure, so everyone was paid the same. If they were making a new work, then they were paid a percentage of that. We also brought everyone in for at least one site visit in advance. Some people came in more than a year in advance to think about, how biennials can be more of a hospitable structure for artists, what artists need to have support, but also how they can be part of the community in Toronto. So some people came for a very long time, some people came for months. Susan Shipley came multiple times and will continue to come. And now we're working currently on part 2. So it's almost as though we're seeing both editions as 2 chapters in a book. So we've done chapter 1 and now we're working towards chapter 2. So what I wanted to share with you now, and then we can have questions at the end, is a project that we did in collaboration with this media art collective who's from the Arctic, called Isuma. And the reason I wanted to show you this image first is this is the Canadian Pavilion at Venice. And for many of you know already that Venice is the oldest biennial in the world. It really comes out of the World's Fair models. That's why there's still national representation. So each country selects an artist or artists. Sometimes they swap. Sometimes biennials or pavilions are rented out to a different country. What we wanted to do actually was to, and maybe this, I know there's someone representing the Canadian government here, but we actually wanted to take off the Canada sign and just have Isuma. But the negotiation in the end was to have Isuma there and the Canada sign. And the only way we could do it, because the people who organize the Venice Biennale are incredibly strict, and they don't allow any signage in front of pavilions anymore, was to argue that our sign was art. Otherwise, they weren't going to let us put it on there. So that's what we did, and it's a good thing we had the inaugural syllabics, because I think that helped. So the writing symbol signs that you see on top of Isuma are they're called inaugural syllabics, and they were originally brought to the Arctic as a way of actually translating the Bible from English into Inuktitut. So it is the writing system primarily of the elders, but some of the younger people as well read Inuktitut. So each symbol has a different sound associated with it. So I wanted to see if I could play you a bit of this trailer, because what was inside the pavilion was one feature-length movie, which was a bit risky, right? Because when people come to the pavilion, they don't necessarily want to sit for more than 90 minutes in one place, for example. They particularly might not want to sit there if it's in a language that they're not familiar with, or a context that they're not familiar with. But we thought it was really, really important to take the risk. One, because Isuma is committed to what they call media democracy, and I'll talk more about that. They're also committed to telling another story of migration and displacement, which definitely I think is something that is affecting people worldwide, and this is their story of it. So let's see if this will play. Let's restart it.
Maceda ni representar.
You have to, because it's not sharing.
Okay, thanks. Okay, here we go. Take 3.
Maceda nila tayo. Ujak sakto ka na po. At yung ano ka, ningi ko ngayon na. Ida, ningi kuluk po. Ningi kuluk siya. Ini sang naksi ko asi dagin na. Ada na kuluk dikya. Tipok tu tinggal di tengah siya, ini sang naksi ya. Ada kuluk. Anak tukar pa. At nagkaktarin na yung nasi. At nagkaktarin. Ano mo yan? Sugar itong nakapapok. At nagkaktarin. Tässä on ottaa tällaisia auto. Ai näin. Akso, sikkoikin. Akka. Sikkoikin. 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 Sikkoikin.
What just happened? He says, not too hard. Taonan nga seuraamme. Niin rasima vaikka, että tämä on yksi teennappu.
Minä varo. Haluaisinkin tori.
Tämä on inunne ikimakata tuinnahtana tusaa jo jattukatekpun.
Haluan tahtoasi.
Tämä on mariksima tuinnahtana katsohan noita ja akotsigitjutigo. Kymyksatsigetjutigo. Tää on inunne jo Naasautin apersuijahtukatiktu.
Asua. Sandali tänne tipoktoongaksiaa. Kai pagana idunilutiaa. Alena kolpikia. Aku di sini tulau kalau. Nak maksio.
Taonane seuraamme tämän maksimaju.
Yksiä.
Tämä on yksi teennahtuko utsuni.
Säkin ollut sakkaa täällä majakkaan.
Sekä kaasalla kuinen ja teere. Sukaklo sivattu tiitty takakka.
Ate takainen tuo sakkaa lukut. Minä sanotti.
Ate nakatan alla syötä eikä mamaktu juuri.
Ai nyt kalppaa. Sukai tulee uudaktuksi. Sukai tulee laukamuun.
It's a good place to stop. So that's the trailer for this feature-length movie. You can already sense that what it's really centered on is the encounter between these two. So one of them they call Boss, who's a white man, and the other is the elder, and this is him. He's actually seal hunting with his family, and his name is Noah Piagatuk. So Noah Piagatuk was one of the last people to move into the settlement of Igloolik. So this was a meeting that took place in the late 1950s that he actually recalled to the filmmaker Zach Kunuk in the 90s. He told him this story because they were doing an oral history project where Zach was talking to a lot of the elders in his community of Igloolik and asking him about stories like this. So Noah didn't want to move to Igloolik because what Noah kept repeating to this guy Boss, who's sent there on behalf and paid on behalf of the Canadian government to convince all the remaining Inuk people who are living on the land to move to the settlements. He was saying to him, Noah said to Boss, he said, well, I don't want to move to a settlement, why would I? The land is my home, this whole land. And he said, well, if you move to the settlement, we'll give you a wooden house, you'll have an education, your daughter will go to school, and you'll have health care, and we'll also give you some money. And Noah said to him, he said, I don't need money here, where I am. The land is our home and also our education. My daughter learns within our community context here. So he really was resistant to him trying to convince him. And then the person who's in the middle is the translator, the person that you heard from already. So he's translating between English and Inuktitut. And Noah asks a question at one point in the movie, and he says, why is this guy not speaking more Inuktitut? And he said, I don't know, he just doesn't seem to get it. And then this idea of mistranslation kind of carries forward because Boss keeps asking the same question. He says, well, when will you move to the settlement? And Noah keeps saying, I'm not moving to the settlement. So, but there's a lot of quite subtle things that are happening as well. Like one of the things that you notice is that Boss is the only person who's dressed in caribou, which means that he's dressed in a way, this is spring because the light is out. In the winter, there's only a little bit of light in the Arctic. So he's too hot. And when you get too hot in the Arctic, you risk dying because if you sweat, your sweat can freeze. So it's very clear, even when he's coming from a distance, that he's an outsider, right? He's dressed wrong, he's not yet speaking the language. The other thing that's a kind of signal at this moment is this was in the middle of the Cold War. And the Arctic, especially the Canadian Arctic, was the front lines of the Cold War. So they had instituted what was called the Distant Early Warning System that was funded by the US government as a kind of listening station because it was the closest place to Russia. And all of those hubs for the Diliman, where any of you are interested in utopian architecture, were all made by Buckminster Fuller. It's kind of fascinating. So, of course, the government wanted to resettle Inuit as well because it showed their sovereignty over the Arctic, right? If you had, people moving all over who were nomadic, then you had no way of showing that you have authority over this land. So it was also a kind of initiative on that behalf, as well as a way to help people who at that time were suffering, not Noah so much, but other parts of the Arctic for sure, were suffering because of the collapse of the fur trade. Because the fur-bearing animals had been hunted to such a degree that the ecosystem was starting to collapse. So people were starving. But what I wanted to talk about, in particular with Isuma, was this idea of self-representation. So it's quite a famous story now of Zach Kunuk, who's from Igloolik, the community that Noah Piagatuk eventually settled in as well. So Zach was down in Montreal getting treatment, actually for tuberculosis, and he brought carvings with him to sell, and then he brought the first Sony Portapack to the Arctic. So it was the first kind of personally accessible film camera that you could use as an individual. It was also very affordable. And the reason that Zach did that is because he was already quite critical of what was being shown on Inuit Broadcasting Corporation, which is a kind of arm of Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or CBC, because what he was seeing on there was not in their language, not in Inuktitut or any of the various dialects. It was not made by them. It was not about them or for them. But what he was noticing at the same time was that all the youth were infatuated with TV. So they weren't necessarily listening to the elders anymore because they were gathering in front of the televisions. And at that time, and even now, a lot of the TV is very communal. So one house will have TV, and everyone goes to that house to watch TV. But in Zach's community of Igloolik, they voted against TV 3 times, and they were one of the last communities to get TV because they only wanted TV on their terms, right? So Zach took it upon himself, and then he formed a company along with Norm Cohen, who's an experimental videographer from Montreal, Paul Apak, and one other collaborator. They made their own company, Isuma. They made it so that they could make their own stories, and they made it so that they could make stories in particular that went back to these moments in time that were moments of great change within Inuit society. So this one, where Noah was being asked to move off his land, is one. But what they realized by making these films is that they could enable the whole community. So they were working with all community members who weren't trained actors. All the women, particularly elder women, became all the costume designers, right? All of the youth were part of the movies so that they can learn from the elders. And so they make everything. So everything in this movie you see is made, or it's a prop that's been brought in to represent that moment in time. You'll see there that Zach was saying that when they started working with the dogs again, because most people use skidoos now, or snowmobiles, that they also had to learn how to make the harnesses in the old way and to make the fan hitch. It's called a fan hitch. So you don't see like a dog, a pair of dogs, a pair of dogs, a pair of dogs, a pair of dogs. The reason for that is because in the Arctic, if those first 2 dogs go into the ice, you're going to go into the ice too. So they make them in a fan so that if one dog gets trapped in the ice, the other dogs can pull them out, and it's actually much safer. And the way that they guide the dogs is using the long whip. So if you want to turn this direction with the dogs, you put your whip over here and then they turn that way. My uncle was a dog sled racer, so. But what I wanted to show you these images too, because this is the making of it. You see the settlement of Igloolik behind, like all the more modern houses. Here you see them filming on the ice. Here you see Lucy, who's a director in Igloolik and one of the main people who's part of Isuma Productions, and she's explaining what's going to happen in all of the different scenes. So when they do the scenes, they write scripts, but Norm Cohen says that he writes the scripts only to get the funding from the government. Don't tell anyone that. They write the scripts so they can get the money, and then what they do is they organize the films just by what action is going to happen at a certain moment in time. So they'll say, this is the moment when Boss comes and he meets Noah. But Boss was actually, he's quite a famous Danish actor. But everyone else is a non-actor, and actually the translator that you saw is Zach's son. So here's everyone getting ready for the shoot, including Noah. And what Zach often does is he will cast someone in a role, particularly a relative. So the person who played Noah Piagatuk in the film is a relative of Noah Piagatuk. So there's this nice kind of intergenerational relationship happening. And then the other intergenerational relationship that you saw, which some of you I think understood it, was they said in the distance, they said, oh, it's grandmother's coming, yeah, it's our grandmother. And then they come and then it's a young man, right? So what that was signifying is that in Inuit culture, the young people are often given the name of one of their relatives, their older relatives. And then you call them your grandfather, even when they're little. So there's this idea for Inuit that you would say lineage is not actually a linear thing, but it's a cyclical thing, right? Everyone comes back. This is Zach Kunuk, the director, with his camera that's insulated to work in the Arctic. Right? Because everything starts to break down in the cold. Because when I was up last time, I was in Cape Dorset and I went to a lot of communities. It was, the coldest it got was minus 56. It's pretty cold. And when it's that cold, you have to wear goggles and everything. And I would always ask someone, I say, you know, is this house 5 minutes walk, 15 minutes? And if it's 15 minutes, you run. And make it in 7. This is a map, a really important map to Zach Kunuk. This is a map that his father made. And what he's writing on the map are all the place names in syllabics, in Inuktitut, because many of the maps, even now, aren't detailed enough, right? They just say settlements, but they don't say the significance of those places, like if that place might have been a good place to hunt seal, for example, and that's why it has that name, or you know, anything like that. And so all of this knowledge he was trying to pass on. And this is a photo of Noah when they were doing the oral history project. So this is Noah Piagatuk, who features at the very end of the film, and it's a beautiful moment where there's this rupture. So you realize that what you've just seen is, you know, many decades in the past. But Noah, as an elder, what he's singing about once he moved to the settlement of Igloolik, he was actually singing about the land and the water still. So he was talking about the importance of land and water. Here's just an example of what the set looked like inside. So they're replicating the house that Noah lived in with his wife and his daughter. And these are communal living situations, so there's never a division in any of the rooms. And we wanted to replicate that idea of communal living or communal viewing in the pavilion itself. So we had the pavilion completely open, no walls as well. We used TV, of course, because TV is a very important part of not only the North, but Isuma. So Isuma now has a channel online called Isuma TV, where everything that they've ever done, including many other Indigenous filmmakers, and you if you want, is uploaded and available for free. So when this pavilion opened, when the new feature opened, one of the really important things for Isuma was that they did not participate in the art market at all. So the same day it opened in Venice, it was made available for free on iTunes for anyone to download. And it was also made available on their website on Isuma TV as part of their commitment to media democracy, because they really understand these films as things that they make for their community first, and then they're translated and subtitles are added when they get distributed outside. And then to finally, one final important thing about this project for Venice was that one of the things that the elders were talking about in Igloolik now is the building of, and the expansion actually, of the Baffinland mine. It's an iron ore mine that trucks out, I think, between 30 and 50 million tons of iron ore annually from that region. The region is Kupuyivik, and Kupuyivik is actually Noah Piagatuk's homeland. So during the opening days of the Venice Biennale, every single one of these big screens, there were 6 of them, was interrupted with a live feed from Igloolik. And what people were talking about, and this was directed by Zach, they were all talking about the effects of the mine on their life. Some of them good, of course, economically, but it's very complicated, right? So all the screens were interrupted with this live feed, and it was the first time that there's ever been a high definition live feed from this part of the Arctic. So it was history making. And then in the final episode, it was really great. All they did in that episode was Zach documented them hunting a seal, which was what Noah was doing before he was interrupted by this guy named Boss, who tried to convince him to move off his land. So with that, I'll end. Thank you for listening to me. Appreciate it. Don't know if people have questions. Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah. So, as you think of your questions, and something to bring back on the framework of our invitation to Candice being discourses of indigeneity in different contexts is something that we're trying to bring in this Eskwela program in a way to see other locations and communities on how ideas of indigeneity are being represented in media, visual art, contemporary art. And so it's always important to have exposure, as I said, to latitudes that may be as far away as what you've brought, climates and temperatures that are clearly distant, maybe not so distant from this AC, but maybe from the temperature outside. And I think it's very much, in the spirit of things that actually happen, bringing back to the place where we are now, the Center of Ethnomusicology, that although it's led and founded, it was founded by Jose Maceda in its interest in what was happening across the Philippines. He was also transnational. No? It was trying to understand what was happening in Southeast Asia, and interest in Afro-Brazilian music, because there is clearly something that is transnational in these stories that have to do with land, Christianization, and their local specificities. You know? And there's a question over there right away, so maybe we'll go there.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. It was enlightening, and it also resonates to some extent in the context of the Philippines, with more than 10% of indigenous people and minorities. My question is, I'm still trying to reformulate it, but I hope I'm going to make sense. I'm curious about aesthetic representations and the context of structures of citizenship. Mm-hmm. It seems like the curatorial here is being, what I'm picking up, and the signal that I'm picking up is not these projects of indigenous representations or indigeneity really has something to do with the structures of citizenship. And talking about this is something that's broadly conceived in a sense that, you pick it up from the issue of, say, guilt, reparation, what do you call this, public apology and stuff like that. So my question is, I wonder where this is coming from. Is it coming from down up or top down approach, or is there such thing as, for instance, a co-implication of such? Because I'm sure that there are also a lot of political utterances of indigenous people, and I think this is global, of say that the structure of citizenship is something that's questioned, if not accommodated. There would be people who refuse it, or maybe because there's an incapacity to be part of such structure of citizenship. And it's quite telling about that the video that you mentioned a while ago, like, no, this is my land, this is my home, land is my education. We don't want to be in that settlement area. And so I wonder what kind, other than that, was the dominant voice in terms of, say, or agency for that matter, in terms of like shaping or reshaping the contour of, say, this kind of structure of citizenship, when we talk about, say, the indigenous people and the current settlers. Thank you very much. I hope it's clear. Thank you.
It's a great question. Thank you. So, a complex one, right? I would say that what you saw with the example of Noapigatuk was, in fact, Inuit couldn't be citizens of Canada and didn't actually have voting rights until very late, because they didn't have these Eskimo tags or these numbers yet, so they couldn't participate in Canadian government. And in fact, until 1960, Indigenous people in Canada were wards of the state. That's how the residential schools could continue, right? Because you didn't even, if the government wanted to take your child and put them in a school, they could, because they had more right than you did. So that was one question of citizenship. But speaking more in terms of contemporary ideas, many, I think even it's embedded in the term First Nations. And for many of us, like I'm called a citizen of Carcross Tagish First Nation. Not a member of a band, but a citizen, because we had a very recent land claim or land agreement, let's say. So we weren't part of any of what in Canada are called the numbered treaties. And with that comes, I think, an idea of self-determination. So there's almost the sense of being nations within nations. And then it becomes very complicated too, because some Indigenous nations do not want to be a part of the kind of, there is a national body that speaks to the government, but a lot of people are critical of that national body and this Indigenous elected representative, because the only people who can elect that representative are the chiefs or the leaders. So it's not a true kind of democratic system, right? So I think at a question of representation, that's one. And I would say that a lot of people then have, not everyone, but thinking about different forms of not only citizenship, but other economies as well, how we can have, I would say, other economies separate from ones that are offered through the federal government to give people a different kind of sense of how they want to govern themselves. So self-governance is definitely a major conversation as well, which affects ideas of citizenship too, right? And then saying that as well, I think that there's many people who will be very clear about identifying as Tlingit, for example, or Kwakwaka'wakw, or Haida, or Mohawk, but not as First Nations broadly, because they're very specific about the community that they belong to and are accountable to. So that's one thing. And then I also think with this video that we just saw, it's a really important idea of question of citizenship at that moment in time as well, because, or agency, maybe, the question of relationship between citizenship and agency, because, for Noah, he really wasn't interested in participating at that moment in time. He didn't want to participate with Canada as a nation because, he was self-sustaining. So, yeah. It's a great question, thank you.
Hi, Candice, yeah.
Yes.
Quick question. Is there I picked up some words you use about repatriation of land in Canada. Is this land that's being expected to give back to the Indigenous tribes and people, or is it an effort to reclaim it or an effort to give it back?
It's both.
Is it a political?
It's both. Yeah, it's political, and then it's interesting because speaking about the things that people feel are actionable coming out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, which is a huge report that's freely available, and if you want a copy, actually, the Canadian government will mail it to you. It's also online. One of the things that some citizens are doing is giving land back, but you also have to think that that comes with a certain kind of responsibility too, because it needs a kind of maintenance, right, as well. And so there's structures that need to be in place for that question, but the land claims question is absolutely still ongoing and will continue to be ongoing. There's an interesting statistic, and I might have it slightly wrong, but it's like 135% of British Columbia is under land claims question, right, or a settled land claim. So it's even broader than, there's overlapping jurisdictions too. But I think at the moment, because of this kind of broader historical reckoning, there's an acknowledgement on behalf of the government too when these land claims were not necessarily settled in the way that they were meant to be settled. So there's a much more open acknowledgement of that at the moment too. And then all of Nunavut is the largest land claim in Canada, so all of that part of the Arctic. And within that, it's all self-governed by Inuit. So it's also a really interesting contemporary example. Mm-hmm. And Nunavut in Inuktitut means our land.
Candice, why did you focus on the Inuit for Venice?
Yeah. So the question was why we focused on Inuit for Venice. One is, and I don't want to say that this was the only reason at all, it's something that came, it wasn't part of our deliberation, was that Inuit have, actually there's been no Inuit artist that's ever been represented at the Venice Biennale in the Canadian Pavilion. The 2 years prior actually, Kanangana Putugu was included in the main pavilion of the Venice Biennale, but for us actually we were interested in Isuma because of these questions that they had, that they were working through around displacement, around actually questions of citizenship that were really informing conversations around the migration of refugees and migrants throughout all of Europe and throughout the South, but also their commitment to media democracy. So they really see themselves as media artists, and our question was, what happens when we bring their work to a bigger international audience? How is their work seen within the bigger history of media art, especially activist media art? So that was our question too. And then I would say that it was also timely. You know, they've been working since the late 80s, and they work both within the realm of traditional cinema as well as within media art. So they kind of cross both. And they became, I guess, best known internationally with a film called Ethnomusicology, The Fast Runner, when it won one of the big prizes at the Cannes Film Festival. But it had many people say to me when they came to the pavilion during the opening days, they said, well, we don't know what happened to them since they made this very popular feature film that was amazing. But this is more representative of the majority of their practice, where they do what you could consider to be docudrama. So a dramatic feature, a reenactment of the past that feels like a documentary, right? And I would say that they get that aesthetic through this direct filmmaking, and the fact that everything for the most part is improvised. I met an elder a long time ago. This was probably in 2000 in Calgary. The sister collective to Isuma is called Arnate, so they're a women's filmmaking collective, and they're amazing. And they were at the Glenbow Museum at a conference, and I asked them, I said, well, what do you think of video from the South, or TV from the South? What do you think of that when it's played in the North? And she said, well, you know, one of the things that we realized right away was that people don't do anything in TV from the South. They only talk. And it was a really good observation, because you'll notice that most of the early videos of Isuma, all they're doing are doing things. Like you see them teaching a younger, small boy to hitch up the dogs. You see them building an ice house. And so it was a way of using video as a form of intergenerational learning too. So for me, that was very experimental. So that's part of the reason that we chose them as well. Yeah. Is there a final question, or is everyone getting hungry?
Very good. I wanted to thank you once again and to give you a round of applause for your presentation. for your generosity of bringing different artists that you presented, also in the first part of the presentation. It's definitely a way for traveling to see a show without the actual mobility. And once again, speaking of mobility, I'd like to again thank the Canadian Embassy for their support of bringing you and for bringing various participants who are doing the seminar. A lot of them, most of them, yes, are here. And we'll continue with Candice tomorrow as the second day of the seminar with those participants. And I will make an announcement, 2 announcements. One is that next week we have a second guest, also linked to indigeneity, but more on how Europe and artists during modernism and in the evolution of modernity in Europe were affected or appropriated or somehow, as you said, Candice, at the seminar, took certain aesthetics and representations of indigenous cultures, and somehow a great part of world history is linked to the evolution of 20th century European history, and he will talk a little bit about that in relation to his more general and broad research on animism. His name is Ansel Frank, and that will take place in our outpost in Makati. All the information is on the website. And I wanted to also acknowledge, is he still here? I didn't see him. Sorry. No, that's okay. We had in the room whose name is Jonas Weiss. He's the Associate Dean for Students Affairs, right? And again, thanks for the Center of Ethnomusicology. We hope to collaborate once again. It was a great time, and thank you. And there's I wanted to also thank our caterers, right? Would you like to?
No, we have catering from a cafe called Rojo, which is located along EDSA in Victoria Sports Station. We also have an anonymous supporter of our Eskwela program who we'd like to thank, who gave scholarships to some of our participants in the seminars. Who gave scholarships. So actually the Canadian Embassy and another friend of Bellas Artes was able to support the mobility of participants to attend our Eskwela program. We're really hoping that this continues because we are aware that it's really hard to get around Manila and all over the Philippines, of course. So we want the program to spread across a lot of, not just across Manila, but all over the country. And we want to try to find ways to have people come and participate and meet our instructors and be exposed a little bit more to what we do, and so that we can also learn from them. So we're open to suggestions. If anyone is aware of communities that would really be interested in joining our programs, please let us know. We're just here. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.